So this is one of the largest PC cases out right now. This is the Asus ROG Hyperion, and it will take up quite a bit of space on your desk. And because this is an EATX case, we don't have to worry about GPU size restrictions. So we should be able to build a pretty sweet PC that can run pretty much any game at our target resolution of 1440p. So yeah, today we're going to be building a mid to high end all Asus gaming PC at the enthusiast level. And every good PC starts with a good CPU. So today we're starting with the i7-13700KF from Intel. It has 16 cores in total, 8 of which are performance cores that can boost up to 5.4 GHz. And honestly, that's pretty insane right out of the box. You could realistically pair this CPU with a 4090 and not have any issue. This CPU is a really good option for the price, especially if you don't need integrated graphics, which for most gaming PC builds, we use a dedicated graphics card anyways, so usually you can save a little bit of money by choosing the KF over the K. This is also one of the more versatile CPUs on the market because we have our choice of using either DDR4 or DDR5 memory kits. Another really cool thing about the 13700KF is that it's compatible with both Z690 and Z790 motherboards, which is perfect for our build today because we'll be going with the Z790 Hero from Asus, and this is a pretty solid motherboard, balancing both aesthetic and performance. For a higher end gaming PC build like we're doing today, this board definitely fits the bill. It has a massive VRM heatsink integrated with this pretty impressive LED I/O right here. And for connectivity, it has pretty much everything you might need for a gaming PC build. It does support one PCIe Gen 5 NVMe and has 4 additional PCIe Gen 4 slots in the typical locations at the top and the bottom of the board. As for connectivity, pretty much everything you need is here. We've got plenty of high-speed USB, Type-C, audio, Wi-Fi 6E, and 2.5 gigabit LAN. This thing is pretty much fully loaded. So let's go ahead and get our CPU installed. I'm sure a lot of you have seen this done a few times, but we just want to make sure we do this carefully. All we have to do is place our CPU into the socket pretty much exactly how you see here. The only thing that may give you some resistance is the lever when the CPU is in the socket, but other than that, we just need to remove the socket cap and our CPU is good to go. For storage, we're going with the Team Group Cardea A440 Pro. This is a 2TB Gen 4 SSD with a 7200 megabyte per second read and a 6000 megabyte per second write. It features a really sleek black and gold design, and it's also compatible with PS5s, which is cool to squeeze some extra value out of it down the line. I use these pretty often in my custom builds, and whenever I'm asked for a storage recommendation, this drive is usually at the top of my list. It's only about $99 on Newegg at the time of this video, and I'll drop a link in the description if you want to check it out. So for memory, we're going with 2 sets of the T-Create Expert DDR5 in 32GB kits. These are 6400 MHz at CL30, which may be a little overkill, but with the prices of DDR5 coming down in the past year, it's really starting to make more sense to make the jump from DDR4. The only issue is that enabling XMP could be unstable on these higher frequency kits when all 4 slots are populated. However, installing them is a lot more straightforward. All we're going to do is unlock these top latches. There is a notch on the module we're going to line up with the notch on the slot, and then we're going to loosely place it in the slot and apply even pressure on the memory DIMM until you hear it lock in. And again, line the next one up the same way, apply some pressure, and you'll hear those pretty satisfying clicks letting you know they're seated. And with the final DIMM in, that is our motherboard fully built, and things are really starting to look pretty good on this. So now it's time to move our motherboard into the case. Sticking with the Asus ROG theme for this build, we're going with their most recent case, the GR701 Hyperion in black. I'm actually pretty excited to build in this case because we haven't seen an offering like this from Asus since the Helios back in 2020. And I just want to say, this case is absolutely massive. It is their most premium case offering, and it comes in at about $469 US. But it really does capture that premium look and feel to it. With the construction materials being mostly made of aluminum and glass, the front and back panels are both made of tempered glass, and they open on a very solid hinge. They come off easily. All you have to do is just lift up on the glass while they're open, and they slide right out. As for what's in the box, we do get a couple of goodies in here. The first thing we have are these super premium sleeved EPS extension cables, and that's actually really cool that they included those for power supplies with shorter cables. It does also come with a metal Phillips head screwdriver and a box to keep all of your accessories in, but for now we just need these screws to install our motherboard. We won't be needing an I/O shield here since our motherboard does have one pre-installed, so we can go ahead and lower the motherboard into the case at kind of an angle to make sure it's aligned with the standoffs and then secure it by screwing it in. The only thing you want to keep in mind here is not to over tighten the motherboard screws because these screws do strip out pretty easily. So just make sure everything's lined up and there's no resistance when you're screwing them in, and you should be good to go. The next component we'll be installing is our power supply. We went with the ROG Strix from ASUS, and this is a great fully modular power supply at 1000 watts, 80 plus gold rating. Will be more than enough power for our system and leaves us a little bit of headroom for some slight upgrades if we decide to go that route in the future. We will need to install all of the cables before putting it into the case because there's no access in the back of the case to do this later on. We'll need the 24-pin motherboard cable, the two 8-pin cables for the CPU, and 3 more 8-pin cables for the GPU. And finally, our SATA cable to power the RGB components that came with the case. Now that all of our cables are plugged in, there's just a few things we have to remove from the case first. On the backside, there's a cable management cover secured with 2 screws. Once they're removed, we can just open it and lift it up and out. Then there's 2 screws holding in the power supply shroud kind of hidden behind the cables coming from the controller. Definitely keep these somewhere safe because we will be needing them later. Then on the front side, there's 2 more screws holding in this decorative trim. Once they're removed, we should be able to just take this off pretty easily and we can slide the power supply shroud out. Now we can grab our power supply and just lower it into the case, making sure the holes are lined up so we can go ahead and secure it with the screws that came with the power supply. Next up, we've got our cooler. Sticking to the ASUS theme and going with the Ryo 3 all-in-one CPU cooler. This is one of the things I'm probably most excited about on this build because it does come with 3 RGB fans, and it has an LCD display that matches that pixelated effect on the I/O of our motherboard. This is a 360mm radiator we have on this cooler, and although we have room for up to a 420mm radiator up at the top of the case, this should be more than enough for our 13700KF. So installation here is pretty straightforward. We just want to align the holes on the fans to the holes on the radiator. The only thing to keep in mind is the direction of your cables because we do want those routed behind the motherboard tray, so it helps to think about the orientation of the tubes coming from the AIO before you install it. And then we just have to secure our fans to the radiator with the long screws that are included. Now would also be a pretty good time to install our splitters and get our LGA 1700 mounting bracket installed onto our motherboard. Installation is pretty easy. We've got a mounting bracket that goes behind the motherboard and some standoff screws that go into the bracket. Once that's in, we can now line up our radiator onto the case and secure it with the included shorter screws. Next is our CPU block. Typically I would suggest mounting this at the front of the case so we could pull ambient air into our radiator, but the tubes are so short on this cooler, we actually have to mount it up at the top. The only concern would be air getting trapped inside of the pump, but we can always just run our pump at higher speeds to try to prevent this. The last thing for our CPU cooler is to get the cables for our RGB and fans routed. This case does have some pretty impressive cable management channels and a pre-installed controller for additional fans and RGB. This case does also have 4 pre-installed 140mm fans, 3 at the front set as intake, and 1 at the back as exhaust. Since they're already plugged in and cable managed, we're going to keep them in place so we only have to manage the cables for the fans that came with our cooler. It doesn't have to be absolutely perfect, but using the cable management channels and zip ties should help quite a bit to keep things nice and neat. And for our last component, we have that one thing that might ease the pain of not having a girlfriend, an expensive graphics card. For this build, we're going with an RTX 4080, and the card we're using today is the ASUS ROG Strix model, and it's priced at about $1,500 US. It is one of the top cards you can purchase, with maybe the exception of a 4090. However, for the difference of about $700 more for the 4090, we found it to only be about 15% faster on average, which means you would get more value out of a 4080 at about a 32 frame difference in most gaming scenarios. And I know these GPUs might be overkill for most people, especially with the price of these cards being so high, so another really good option here would be the 4070 Ti. This card is probably the best value in terms of cost performance, and it's about $400 cheaper than the 4080 at an average of about 157 FPS, bringing the price per frame down to about $1.30 less than the 4080. However, for this build, I think the 4080 is going to be a great fit. The performance of this card is actually really impressive. With a max TDP of 320 watts, we are only pulling about 275 watts in max settings on Apex, hovering at the 299 FPS frame cap consistently while playing for about an hour straight. And it's actually not as loud as I was expecting. There's no audible coil whine, and even when pushing the system in firm arc, we could barely hear any audible fan noise. We were hovering at about 40 decibels at max load, which is 5 decibels quieter than our mouse clicking at the beginning. Our temps went from a low of about 35 degrees, peaking at 61 degrees under extended gaming loads, and that's pretty good considering we're using an AIO and not a custom cooling solution. The cooler on this card is absolutely massive, coming in at 358 millimeters long, 3.5 slot design, 3 fans. I'd say for most cases this would be a tight fit. We are going to be vertically mounting this card, so here I've gone with this CableMod Gen 4 riser and vertical bracket. Unfortunately, the case did not come with a riser cable, and even if it did, I still probably wouldn't use it because this case is designed for the riser to mount directly to the power supply shroud. And if you remember, the cables for the power supply were not accessible from the back side of the case. So if we ever needed to access our PSU cables, we would have to take the GPU out, and if our GPU is water cooled, that would be a huge inconvenience. However, this bracket worked great and our GPU fits perfectly. Now we just have to plug it in with the 12-pin adapter that came in the box with the graphics card, slide some of our panels back on the case to clean things up, and the last thing we have to do is put the screwdriver in the spot on the power supply shroud, and that is our build complete.